Have you ever noticed that the soundtrack of the first Ratchet & Clank sounds a little off compared to its sequels? No? Only I'm that needlessly pedantic? Okay, fine. But it's true. Ratchet & Clank's soundtrack is of noticeably lesser quality than the games that follow it, which is especially apparent when you compare it to the 6 repurposed tracks in Up Your Arsenal. Yes, I know it's 6 tracks now, just shut up. But I guess logically the next thing to do is to ask the rhetorical question that seems aimed at the audience but instead acts as a transition into the main contents of the video, proposed as the question that the video will attempt to answer. Why is the quality of Ratchet & Clank's soundtrack noticeably worse than its sequels? Well, it all has to do with one fact: mono audio. You see, all of the tracks in Ratchet & Clank 1 are mixed in mono. Again, I know that now, so just shut the fuck up. Anyway, for some reason, all of the music in the first game was mixed into mono, that is, one audio channel rather than 2 left and right, or stereo channels. Mono audio can be useful. For example, the audio I'm recording for my voice is in mono, but in music it can affect the quality in very meaningful ways. When you mix 2 tracks into one, they can fight with each other, which messes with its quality. For one, it typically results in less dynamic range, or the difference between the quietest and loudest parts of the track, as something that's quiet in 2 channels will be amplified when mixed to one, and logarithms and shit result in that happening more to the quieter parts than the louder parts. There's also a reduction in soundstage. It doesn't matter how open your headphones are if there's no difference between the left and right channels to create space. And lower frequencies, the bass essentially, gets amplified for some complicated reasons I don't fully understand. I'll just leave it at phasing issues and move on. But it's complicated and confusing, and it affects different tracks more than others. Some tracks, in fact I'd say most of them, don't actually sound too bad, but there are a couple that get fucked by the mono mixing, with the Velden Orbit destroying the cannons in specific sounding like actual garbage. What's most interesting about this is also something we can't directly determine, which is why. We were using stereo audio in some form all the way back in the 90s with the second-gen consoles, so it seems a bit strange to go back like this. What's even stranger is that Spyro, the games Insomniac worked on previously, had stereo tracks, not exclusively, but with a high majority, and that was on a PS1, a step down in both hardware and data limits. What's most strange of all is that the engine supported stereo music, and I'll get back to how we know that to be true later, but before that we could assume that the reason that the tracks are in mono is to save space. Half the channels means half the space needed to store the music, and while I agree that it's possible this is the reason, personally I'm not fully convinced that's the case. The size of a single music track as stored on disk is only about 400 kilobytes, and ignore how I know that, again I'll explain that later. So for the 43 tracks of the first game, it would only save around 17 megabytes, which is not nothing, I grant you, and they did do a lot to fit these games on the 4 gigabytes of a single layer DVD. But the fact that it wasn't an issue in the later games, especially Up Your Arsenal and Gladiator, which are effectively 2 games in one disc, leads me to think that there's more there than just space savings. Now, without being the developers of the games, we can't exactly know what the reasoning behind this mono audio decision is, but at the very least, we can take a deeper look into these games and see if we can't find anything interesting. Specifically, I think it's time we take a look through the game's files. Now, if you just go and look at what's inside a standard Ratchet 1 DVD, it's a bit, well, useless. Fortunately, members of the modding community have made a really cool open source tool called Wrench, which can do a bunch of stuff, but all we really care about is its ISO extraction feature. Luckily, they built a user interface, so it's less scary to those terminally illiterate, although hopefully you can make it through the extremely scary install process of running 4 commands. But regardless, it's fairly simple to dump the contents of the disk into something that's at least a little more manageable. Unfortunately, it's not going to do all the work for us. All of the audio data is still in these proprietary .wad files, but assuming it's stored in some kind of documented standard, we should be able to see it in there. This is where our friend the hex editor comes in. Now, I know to a lot of you this probably just looks like gibberish, but we actually don't need to do a lot here, so stay with me, I promise this will make sense. All this is showing is the data that's stored in the file. Like, you know how computers only see data in binary? This is that. except 8-bit characters, or a byte, are represented by 2 hexadecimal characters. This is how we can determine the size of the music track, by the way. We can see the literal amount of data that is used to define it. So if we look at the start of one of these audio tracks, we can start to see how this works. For instance, these 4 bytes at the start of the track are the audio sample rate, in this case 44,100 Hz or 44.1 kHz. Here is what the track is called, and there's some other control information here that I don't understand, before we get to the actual audio data, which starts here. The most important part, however, is the 4 bytes at the very beginning of the track data, which spell out the string VAGP. This is the string that denotes the beginning of a file encoded in the VAG audio format. It's a proprietary Sony format used for PlayStation games, and most importantly, this audio format only supports mono audio. Well, I think. All of the resources I find seem to point to it supporting stereo audio, but I'm about 99% sure that the version of the format that was used to encode this audio only supports mono, as all the tools I can find only seem to support VAG in mono, and the way that the games store music points to only supporting mono, given that the sections that are used to denote the number of channels in the header is blank. Although the version number is also weird, it should be either 2 or 3, but it's 32, so what exact version of the standard they're using is not exactly clear. We can ignore that though. There's a much clearer reason to assume that the format only supports mono. You see, for any given music track, at least for the ones in Going Commando and onwards, the ones that are in stereo, there are actually 2 separate music tracks for any given section of music, appropriately titled L and R. Yes, you did hear that right. The games do in fact store the left and right audio channels as separate tracks, which is definitely the most interesting thing that I found looking through these games' files. Most modern audio formats interweave the left and right audio data, making it easier to process as the data can be read continuously rather than jumping back and forth, but even still, having 2 separate tracks with their own header data and names to store the left and right audio channel is something you would only really do if the audio format itself didn't support stereo. So that's one mystery solved. The audio format only supports mono. But that just leads to more questions. I mean, clearly they were able to work past that limitation to get stereo music into the 2nd, 3rd and Gladiator games, so why not the 1st? I mean, maybe they hadn't built the feature that stitches the 2 audio tracks into the engine yet, and they only did that for Going Commando and subsequent releases? Well, unfortunately, we know that's not true. There is one final thing that tells us that the engine, as it was developed for the first game, did in fact support stereo music. The August 2nd prototype disc. This is a pre-release copy of the first Ratchet Clank, which contains a bunch of interesting stuff. This wasn't a demo, those are intended to be shown to the public at stuff like press events, E3, that kind of deal. This pre-release copy was, by contrast, presumably for internal use, complete with debug menus, missing audio, and a bunch of other interesting things. But what we're most interested in is the music it used, and as you can probably guess, it's all in stereo. Before you get excited, no, this isn't our ticket to finding a stereo copy of the first game's soundtrack. A lot of the tracks aren't present, and many of the ones that are have been composed slightly differently, like Rilgar and Nebula G34. What this tells us though is that the first game's engine, at least at some point in time, did in fact support stereo music tracks, in the same way that the next games did. The prototype's disc isn't as obscured as the final release, so we don't need to extract the data. The same is true for Going Commando for some reason as well, by the way. But taking a look through the files shows that the music for this prototype is stored in the same way, with separate tracks for the left and right channels. This has a pretty big implication. We can extrapolate from this fact that the soundtrack was not developed in mono. It was recorded in stereo and then mixed down into mono. That might seem obvious, but then that begs the question, where is that version of the soundtrack now? There is almost certainly a copy of Ratchet & Clank's soundtrack that is fully mixed in stereo, or at least there was. It might no longer exist. It has been almost 20 years after all since the game was originally published, but assuming it hasn't been lost to time, it might still be out there. Believe it or not, we've actually had glimpses of a higher quality version of the soundtrack, not just from this demo, but also from a certain composer's SoundCloud. The first game's Metropolis theme, it's right here, helpfully titled O2 Game Music Reel. There's a lot more here as well, a bunch of tracks from all the games he's worked on, all with proper fade-outs to boot. There's stuff from Going Commando all the way to Gladiator, and while being on SoundCloud means they've probably been compressed just as much as the ones that are burned onto the discs, I doubt they were when they were uploaded, which was only in 2016. So Insomniac, I have a proposal. You already fucked up redoing the first game's soundtrack once, so why not try again? Try and track down the original, high-quality version of this music. Maybe give them proper fade-outs if the original project files exist. Not likely, I'm aware. And re-release the soundtracks of all of the games on the PS2. You released the soundtrack for Rift Apart, it wouldn't be a conceptual stretch to do it for these games as well. Maybe as a 20th anniversary special, Oh, and maybe you could release Flax as well, and... What the fuck am I talking about? You're not going to do any of that, nor do you need to. This is just the ramblings of a nostalgic idiot. But in any case, at the very least, you now have some very specific, useless technical knowledge about a game from 20 years ago. So I hope you at least enjoy that. But I'm sure this action looks real sus, but it's by teleprompter. But also from a certain composer's SoundCloud, I should enunciate that better. What's most interesting about this is there's people. Okay, yep, no, I'm not doing that. I'm done. I'm done for this take.